never imagined that I would go through something like this. I spent more than 20 years of my life in the convent, dedicating my days to prayer, silence, and the pursuit of a deeper connection with God. My faith had always been my fortress, my foundation. But that night, April 17th, 2023, something happened. Something that changed everything. I was in my room, finishing my last prayer before sleep, when I felt a strange weight on my chest. It wasn't an ordinary pain. It was as if my very soul were being pulled out of my body. An intense fatigue overwhelmed me. My vision darkened, and before I could understand what was happening, I completely lost control of my body. I collapsed to the floor without strength, somehow knowing that this might be my last moment on earth. But death did not come as I had imagined. On the contrary, I felt more alive than ever. Suddenly I realized that I was there, standing, yet also on the floor. My body lay motionless, and yet my consciousness was clear, vivid, free. There was an indescribable peace around me, a sensation of lightness I had never experienced before. I was floating, observing everything with an indescribable clarity. The convent walls seemed different, as if bathed in a soft light, and a profound silence filled the air. I knew that something divine was happening. I was not alone. While I was assimilating what was happening, an invisible force pulled me upward, as if I were being guided by something far beyond my comprehension. The convent ceiling was no longer a barrier, and in moments I found myself ascending, crossing an immense space filled with a golden pulsating light. It was not an ordinary light. It was alive, enveloping, imbued with a peace that filled me completely. There was no fear, nor anguish, only a deep certainty that I was going to where I truly belonged. But before I could fully surrender to that ecstasy, my attention was drawn downward, where I saw the earth shrinking in size. A tightening seized me, as I realized the darkness looming over the world, a thick fog that seemed to envelop everything and everyone. Then everything changed. Suddenly, I was no longer floating in the void. I was transported to a completely different place, a vast space where the very atmosphere vibrated with an indescribable presence. It was as if the universe itself had paused to witness what was about to happen. And then, I saw him. At the center of that environment of light and majesty stood Jesus, but he was not merely a distant figure or a symbol of faith. He was real, immense, radiating a love that penetrated to the very last fiber of my being. His eyes met mine, and in a single glance I knew that he knew me completely. All my doubts, my prayers, my moments of faith and even weakness were laid bare before him. I wanted to speak, to ask so many things, but my voice was not needed. The communication between us was not like that on earth, where words are often insufficient. With a simple look, Jesus made me feel a love so pure and intense that it tore down all the barriers within me. It was as if, for the first time, I was truly face to face with absolute truth. Yet at the same time, there was a weight, an urgency. Something was about to be revealed, something I needed to see. Without him uttering a single word, I was engulfed by an overwhelming vision. Suddenly I was no longer in that celestial environment. I was transported to a new scene, a panorama of the world, but not as I had known it. The earth was shrouded in a dark, dense, suffocating fog. I could see entire cities immersed in this darkness, but the most frightening part was that people did not seem to notice. They went about their routines, laughing, talking, entertained by their bright screens, consumed by endless distractions. I saw families sitting together, yet completely separated, each immersed in their own digital worlds. I saw churches, but many of them were empty of meaning, places where faith had been transformed into a spectacle without substance. The enemy was not attacking with violence or despair, but rather with subtlety, keeping humanity numb, distracted, too occupied to realize that something was wrong. I wanted to look away, to deny what I was seeing, but it was impossible. The truth was right before me, raw and naked. I saw religious leaders who once preached with passion, now adapting their messages to be more acceptable, more modern. I saw people who considered themselves spiritual, yet who never sought a true relationship with God, content with a superficial, uncommitted faith. And the most frightening of all, I saw many who believed they were on the right path, but in reality were drifting further away, deceived by a false sense of security. There was something insidious behind all of this, an invisible force manipulating humanity without them realizing it. Then, the vision changed. I saw the future, a future where technology had become more than just a tool, but a mechanism of absolute control. People accepted digital implants without question, seduced by the promise of ease and convenience. Artificial intelligences dictated what they should think, feel, and even believe. And most terrifying of all, I saw churches embracing this new era without resistance, justifying every step with arguments of progress and inclusion. True faith was being replaced by a diluted, harmless version without power. Few realized what was happening, and those who tried to warn were ridiculed, silenced, discredited. My heart ached as I saw all this. How could this be happening? How could so many people be accepting this new reality without realizing what was really behind it? Then, I saw something even worse. I saw those who dared to resist being isolated, treated as fanatics, as threats to progress. I saw families being torn apart, people being forced to choose between their faith and their survival. The control was not imposed with immediate violence, but with something even more dangerous. The illusion that all of this was for the good of humanity. And it was then that I understood. This was the enemy's true plan. He didn't need to destroy faith, only to render it irrelevant, empty, without purpose. I turned to Jesus, desperately seeking answers, seeking hope. And then, he spoke. His voice was unlike any sound I had ever heard. It was pure truth, piercing directly into my soul. The enemy's greatest deception is not the direct attack, but the subtlety of spiritual slumber. He said, "The world believes it is advancing, but in reality, it is drifting further away from the only truth that can save it." His words struck me like lightning. I understood in that moment that my own faith was not as strong as I had believed. I considered myself devout, but how many times had I grown complacent? How many times had I followed rituals without truly seeking a deep relationship with God? The revelation tore me apart inside. I had always believed that my life in the convent was the pinnacle of my devotion, that my routine of prayers and fasts made me a faithful servant. But there, before Jesus, I realized how mechanical my faith had become. I did everything right, yet without a true connection, without the fervor that transforms the soul. And then, he showed me something even more terrifying: the judgment. I saw people before God's throne, waiting to enter the kingdom of heaven. Many were confident, sure that they would be welcomed. But then, I heard the words that made me tremble. "I never knew you. Depart from me." They had followed religions, performed good deeds, but never sought a genuine relationship with God. The shock and sorrow on their faces were unbearable to witness. My very being shrank in the face of it all. How many people did I know who were in the same situation? How many were deluded, believing that merely belonging to an institution or following external rules would be enough? The truth hit me like a devastating blow. The enemy did not need to make people hate God. He only needed to keep them lukewarm, satisfied with superficial faith, so that they would never seek true transformation. It was in that moment that I understood the purpose of my experience. I needed to return. I had to tell the world what I had seen. But the thought of leaving that place, of distancing myself from the presence of Jesus, was unbearable. I wanted to stay. I wanted to lose myself forever in that light, in that indescribable peace. But the decision was not mine. Before I could beg to remain there, I felt an irresistible force pulling me back. It was as if I were being sucked into an invisible whirlwind, an overwhelming drag that tore me from that realm of glory and hurled me back into earthly reality. The sensation was brutal. The light began to dissipate. The sounds around me became muffled, and suddenly I was plunged into darkness. My body felt heavy, crushingly dense, as if it were returning into something too small to contain what I had experienced. And then I heard voices, machines beeping, felt a weight on my chest. My eyes opened. I was back. The first thing I saw was the white ceiling of the hospital, the fluorescent lights flickering weakly. There were doctors around me, nurses running back and forth, expressions of shock and surprise on their faces. I had died. For 12 minutes my heart had not beaten. My body was lifeless. But there I was, breathing again, feeling the throbbing pain in my chest. hearing the murmurs of disbelief from the doctors. I wanted to speak, to recount everything I had seen, but my mind was still trapped in the experience. The truth was overwhelming. I had been in the presence of Jesus. I had seen what was to come, and now I had to find a way to share it all. In the following days, my recovery was considered a miracle by the doctors. None of them could explain how I had returned to life without any after effects, how my heart simply began to beat again, after so long without activity. But I knew I was not there by chance. I had been sent back, and that truth weighed on me like an impossible responsibility to ignore. However, I was not prepared for what was to come next. When I tried to recount my experience to the other nuns and to the priests of the convent, I was met with looks of doubt, discomfort, and in some cases, total disbelief. Some listened to me with curiosity, but most reacted with skepticism. The most painful part was realizing that even within the church, the truth I had received was not welcome. Some told me that I must have had a hallucination, that my brain had probably created images to comfort me at the moment of death. Others suggested that I rest, that I stop insisting on this story. But I knew it wasn't just a mere figment. I saw the future. I saw the great illusion that was taking hold of humanity. And the more I tried to speak, the more resistance I encountered. It was then that I realized that my mission would not be easy. I not only had to tell what I saw, I had to fight for people to believe it. I decided that if the people around me did not want to listen, I would find others who did. I began sharing my experience with those who showed interest, talking with visitors to the convent, writing about what I had lived. And then something surprising happened. Some people began to seek me out in secret, devotees who felt, deep in their souls, that something was wrong with the world. People who had already had strange dreams, premonitions, unexplained spiritual unease. They believed me because somehow they already sensed that something was about to happen. But at the same time, I noticed that the more my story spread, the more resistance arose. Videos of my testimonies were taken down from the internet without explanation. My words were distorted, and some people even accused me of spreading unnecessary fear. I didn't understand. How could they deny something so evident? How could they not see that everything I had seen was already beginning to happen? But then I remembered what Jesus had shown me. The humanity was being kept in a constant state of distraction. The enemy didn't need to attack directly. He only needed to ensure that people were too busy to notice the truth. Even within the church, many were already entangled in this illusion. My heart grew heavy with sorrow, but I knew I could not give up. I decided that I would not remain silent. If the message was being blocked in some places, I would find new ways to spread it. I began giving my testimony in person, speaking with those who truly wanted to listen. I went to small communities, spoke with prayer groups, shared my experience with anyone willing to hear. Some people were deeply moved, feeling that my words touched something within them that had long been dormant. Others, however, reacted with skepticism, discomfort, even anger. But I could no longer worry about acceptance. I had received a calling, and I knew that I had to fulfill my mission, regardless of the consequences. Then, the attacks began to intensify. People who once respected me started to avoid me. Some priests warned me not to cause a stir, saying that my experience did not align with the traditional teachings of the church. I was called alarmist, exaggerating, even unstable. But I knew this would happen. Jesus had shown me that those who speak the truth would be ridiculed, discredited, combated. And even so, something inside in me burned, a fire that could not be extinguished. I could no longer return to the life I once knew. The world I knew was no longer the same, and I could not pretend that I was unaware of what was coming. Over time, I began to notice something even more unsettling. It wasn't just resistance or disbelief that I faced, it was fear. Many of the people who listened to me felt, deep down, that my words were true, but did not want to admit it. It was easier to ignore, to carry on with life as usual, to believe that everything was fine. Facing the truth meant change. It meant giving up certain securities. It meant accepting that the world was not as they thought. And that was the hardest part for most. After all, who wants to accept that they are being deceived? Who wants to admit that perhaps they have lived with closed eyes for so long? Yet, even in the midst of this, I also saw hope. Some people began to awaken. The message I carried was not just a warning, but a call for preparation. Jesus had sent me back not to spread fear, but to call people back to Him, for them to strengthen themselves spiritually before it was too late. I began to notice small signs of change: families praying together again, people turning off their screens to seek more time with God, smaller churches returning to preaching with fervor and truth. The spiritual battle was unfolding before our eyes, and although many were blind, there were those who were beginning to see. However, opposition was also growing. I realized that the more my message spread, the more obstacles emerged. Some people who once supported me began to distance themselves, fearful of being associated with me. My accounts were constantly questioned, distorted, or ignored. Even within the church, where I expected to find refuge, I felt an increasing coldness. The truth was too uncomfortable to be accepted without resistance. But this did not surprise me. Jesus had already shown me how the world was asleep and how few truly sought a living faith, a genuine relationship with God. And still, I refused to give up. I knew I was not the only one going through this. Along my journey, I began to meet other people who had also experienced similar events. Some had dreams, others visions, and some, like me, had near-death experiences and returned with urgent messages. Our accounts connected, like pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, formed a clear picture of what was to come. Something big was approaching, a transformation that would define the destiny of many souls. And despite the rejection, the doubt, and the persecution, we knew we could not stop. Time was short, and the truth needed to be told. Every day, I felt more acutely the urgency of my mission. It was not just a personal experience I had lived. It was a warning, a call for people to wake up before it was too late. But the more I spoke, the more I realized that many simply did not want to listen. Some ridiculed me, others avoided me, and there were those who remained silent, not knowing how to react. The truth was uncomfortable. It demanded action. It demanded change. And change has always been something that people fear. Yet inside me, something burned like an unquenchable fire. The memory of Jesus' gaze, the urgency in His words, drove me forward even when everything seemed to be against me. I began to notice a pattern. Those who chose to listen, who truly opened themselves to this truth, reported feeling something awaken within themselves. Some began to have revelatory dreams. Others started to feel a constant restlessness, as if something invisible were trying to warn them. There were those who, previously completely skeptical, began to question the world around them, noticing the subtleties of the deception that surrounded us. And it was then that I realized that my mission was not to force anyone to believe. My role was to plant the seed. Only God could make that truth grow within each person. Over time, I began to accept that not everyone was ready to listen. At first, it frustrated me. It saddened me. I wanted everyone to understand, to awaken, to realize what was happening before it was too late. But then, I remembered Jesus' words. He did not send me back to force anyone, but to speak the truth, to give people the chance to choose. The decision was theirs. God never imposed anything on anyone. He always gave free will, and I realized that I needed to do the same. My role was to share, to alert, to guide, but each person would have to decide for themselves if they were willing to see. That brought an unexpected peace to my heart. I knew that many would still mock me, call me crazy, try to silence me, but I also knew that some souls were listening. Some were awakening, and if even one person found their way back to God because of what I testified, then everything would have been worthwhile. I did not need recognition, nor did I need for people to believe in me en masse. My mission was not about me. It was about Him, about the calling He gave me, and about the truth that, whether people liked it or not, was already being revealed. But there was something that still deeply worried me. If what I saw was truly coming to pass, then time was running out. It was not just a matter of individual faith, but something much greater. I saw the signs around me, the growing dependence on technology, the blind acceptance of systems of control, the way even the faithful were becoming increasingly lukewarm and complacent. Everything Jesus had shown me was happening before my eyes, step by step, without most realizing it. This filled me with an even greater sense of urgency. I knew I could not stop. If the doors of the church were closing on me, If the channels of communication blocked me, I had to find another way. And then, I began to see something that filled me with hope. Despite all the resistance, there were those who were coming together. Small groups of believers, people who felt the same, calling, who perceived the same unease. Some of them had had their own experiences, their own revelations, and when we shared our stories, everything made sense. It was as if God were quietly raising his warriors, preparing those who were willing to listen, to see, to strengthen themselves. The world might be immersed in distraction, but there were still those who were awakening, and it was for them that I had to continue. It was at that moment that I understood something essential. The true battle was not against those who rejected or mocked me. It was not against the church that ignored me or against the systems that tried to silence me. The struggle was spiritual. What was happening in the world was not merely the result of political decisions, technological advances, or social changes. It was an invisible war, fought in the heart of every human being, between truth and illusion. And this war would not be won with arguments nor with evidence, but with faith. Only those who sought a genuine relationship with God would be able to see. And as much as that saddened me, I knew I could not carry that burden alone. So I did what I had always done throughout my life. I surrendered everything to God. I laid my burden at his feet and asked him to guide my every step. I was no longer afraid of being rejected, ridiculed, or discredited. What mattered was that I was fulfilling the purpose he gave me. I would speak until my last day. I would speak to those who wanted to listen, without expecting recognition, without caring about the number of people who followed or believed in me. Because, in the end, all that mattered was that the truth was being told, and those who were ready to see it would see it. With that certainty in my heart, I continued my mission. I began to travel, to share my testimony wherever I could find space. Small churches, discreet meetings, informal gatherings, anywhere there was someone willing to listen. I didn't have a large platform, nor recognition, but I realized that it didn't matter. The message I carried didn't need spotlights. It only needed to find the right people. And, little by little, I began to see the fruits. People who were once spiritually asleep began to seek God more earnestly. Families returned to praying together. Young people began to question the world around them, realizing that they were being carried away by invisible currents, away from faith. But I also began to notice something else. The more the truth spread, the more the world seemed to harden against it. It wasn't just institutional barriers or online censorship. It was something deeper. People's hearts were closing. I saw friends drifting away, acquaintances looking at me with distrust, even those who had previously shown interest beginning to hesitate. It was as if an invisible force were trying to stifle any spark of awakening before it could grow. And then, once again, I remembered Jesus' words. The great illusion would not come as a sudden blow, but as a veil that slowly covered everyone's eyes, a veil that many would choose not to lift. It was hard to accept. I wanted to believe that by sharing my experience, people would immediately wake up, understand the danger they were in, and run back to God. But reality was different. Most did not want to change. The illusion was comfortable, safe. Questioning meant giving up certainties, admitting that perhaps they had been deceived for years. I saw that conflict in the eyes of those who listened to me. Some wanted to believe, but others clung desperately to normalcy. Because if what I was saying were true, then everything they knew would have to be reconsidered. And that was a truth too difficult for many to bear. Even so, I continued. For every door that closed, another opened. For every person who mocked me, there was another who wept upon hearing my story, feeling something awaken within them. And it was for those people that I spoke. I couldn't save the entire world, but I could reach those who were ready to listen. And deep down, I knew that this was the only way. God does not force anyone to follow him. He calls, he warns, he invites, but the decision always belongs to each person. And that, perhaps, is the true test of humanity, choosing between uncomfortable truth and convenient lies. As time passed, I began to notice something even more unsettling. The changes I had seen in my experience began to manifest in the world even more clearly. Technology advanced by leaps and bounds, and people accepted it without question. I saw churches adopting increasingly modern systems, but not to bring people closer to God, instead to make them even more passive, even more dependent on a model that, little by little, removed the need for a true spiritual connection. It was exactly as Jesus had shown me, faith being diluted, transformed into something convenient, without depth, without commitment. And then I understood the true weight of my mission. I was not here to prevent all of this from happening, because, in a way, it was already happening. My calling was to prepare those who were willing to see, to help them strengthen their faith before the great illusion was complete. The battle was not to save the entire world, but to ensure that those who sought the truth had the chance to find it. God was calling his people to separate themselves from deception, to remain steadfast even when everything around them seemed to crumble. And that was the choice each person had to make: remain blind in comfort or awaken to the truth, no matter the cost. This understanding changed my perspective. Before, I felt immense frustration watching so many people reject the truth, realizing that the world continued on its course without seeing what was coming. But now, I understood that my role was not to force anyone to believe. My role was to testify, to speak to those who were ready to listen, to let God work in hearts and allow the seed to grow in his own time. And that was the greatest lesson I learned from my experience. The truth never disappears. It can be ignored, it can be ridiculed, it can be hidden, but it never ceases to exist. And sooner or later, everyone will have to face it. So, I continued with my mission. There were still challenges, moments of loneliness, and those who saw me as a lunatic. But there was also hope. I saw it in the small changes, in people returning to seek God sincerely, in those who realized that they needed to prepare spiritually for what was coming. I knew I would not see the complete outcome of what I had started. This was a journey larger than any human being, but I also knew that on the day I finally left this world, I would have no regrets. Because despite all the difficulties, I fulfilled what Jesus asked of me. I do not know what the future holds for us. What I saw and experienced left me with more questions than answers, but also with an unshakable faith that the truth, no matter the cost, must be shared. I know that in the end it will be between each person and God, and it is He who will guide the path of those who truly seek Him. All I can do is continue speaking, continue warning, and hope that others follow the same path of awakening. My mission is not to conclude the story, but to ignite a flame that others can carry. Because in the end, I know that this is the true purpose of all things: to keep the light of truth alive before the great illusion takes hold of everyone. Today, I look back and see that everything made sense. My experience was not a coincidence nor a deviation from the life I had planned. It was my mission, my calling. And despite the pain, the difficulties, and the resistance, I know that I did what I was called to do. The world may continue on its course, but the truth remains. And one day, everyone will have to face it. Until then, my mission continues: to spread the light, even when it seems small in the face of darkness. Because, in the end, it is the light that prevails.